For years, whenever winter arrived, you used your massive custom-built Kenworth V-Plow to clear the snow on this steep mountain pass completely free of charge, helping hundreds of HOA households commute to work and pick up their kids safely. That is until November 3rd, when a cold lilac purple envelope was delivered right into your hands. It was the favored shade of suburban committees, the kind of people who always believed that nature was something that could be negotiated by a majority vote of those present. Inside was a letter with a formal letterhead, the Grand Heights Luxury Estate Homeowners Association, from the desk of Beatrice Thorne, President. It read, "Dear Mr. Mitchell." The letter began in a Calibri font, trying so hard to look classy as if it were hand-engraved on artisanal parchment. The board has noted that your continued operation of an unapproved industrial-grade snow removal vehicle on the scenic incline of Grand Heights Boulevard has resulted in a severe degradation of its aesthetic appeal. Specifically, on the morning of November 1st, your vehicle left behind excess soot, black tire scuff marks, and unsightly compacted piles of dirty snow along the pristine snow-covered asphalt of our private shared right-of-way. Please be advised that pursuant to Bylaw 14.4, Preservation of Seasonal Visual Harmony, all residents and easement holders must maintain the aesthetic integrity of the shared roadways. You are hereby fined $500 for defacing a winter scenic route. Furthermore, you are required to immediately cease and desist all unauthorized snow removal operations on Grand Heights Boulevard. The board has officially contracted a professional, certified, and eco-friendly snow management company for the upcoming winter. Your old truck, affectionately referred to by some as the Leviathan, is no longer welcome on our roads. We expect your full compliance to protect the community's property values and maintain the serene, untouched beauty of this mountain paradise. Vance looked out through the soaring triple-pane windows of his workshop. The glass was cold to the touch, insulated by a double vacuum seal, but the air outside had already turned freezing, carrying that sharp electromagnetic tension that always heralded a harsh mountain winter. Below him, stretching out like a frozen snake, gleaming through the towering old pines standing guard and the sheer granite walls, was Grand Heights Boulevard. It was a beautiful road, but as Vance knew all too well, it was a pretty lie. That road wasn't a public highway, nor was it maintained by the county. It was, in fact, an easement. It cut right through Vance's 400-acre ranch, a rugged stretch of Colorado granite sweet alpine meadows and ancient blue spruces that his grandfather Silas Mitchell had homesteaded back in 1894. Back then, Grand Heights was nothing but a logging camp where desperate, shivering men died of scurvy, the freezing cold, and plain bad luck. Silas survived because he understood this mountain. I knew where the wind wouldn't tear you apart, where the spring water ran pure, even in January, and how to frame a log roof that wouldn't cave in under 10 tons of wet, heavy-packed mountain snow. When the real estate developers came knocking in the late 90s, waving fat corporate checks and smelling of expensive aftershave, they bought out the lower valley and the upper ridge drafting plans to build a paradise for the nouveau riche. They threw up massive glass and steel cabins worth more than what Silas Mitchell could have earned in 3 lifetimes. But they couldn't buy Vance's mountain. He had turned down every one of their offers, just as his father Arthur had done before him. To connect their multi-million-dollar mountainside estates to the state highway, below the developers had no choice but to beg the Mitchell family for an easement. The easement was granted under a simple but ironclad deed signed in the winter of 1996. It was a masterpiece of old-school rural legal drafting, perpetual right-of-way for personal vehicles owned by residents of the Grand Heights subdivision, provided that no city, county, or state funds ever be used to maintain, pave, or repair the road. The developers happily accepted the terms. They paved the road, erected an elaborate timber-framed entrance sign, and set up an HOA to run it. For 30 years, Vance's father, and then Vance himself, plowed that road. They didn't do it for the money. They didn't do it for praise, and certainly not for validation from the wealthy retirees living in their hilltop mansions. They did it because they were neighbors, and because Vance owned the Leviathan, a 1974 Kenworth truck retrofitted with a 12-foot custom-welded steel V-plow, powered by a twin-turbo Detroit diesel that roared with a deep mechanical growl you could hear 3 valleys over whenever it climbed the grade. When brutal winter storms barreled down from the Continental Divide, dumping 4 feet of snow in a single afternoon, the county plows were nowhere to be found. The private contractors from Denver were a no-show too. Only Vance showed up. He would climb into the Leviathan's towering cab, reeking of grease and chicory coffee at 4 in the morning, drop that massive iron blade and scrape a 12-foot wide path of black asphalt, so the lawyers, surgeons, and tech executives of Grand Heights could drive their luxury SUVs down to the city without ever realizing just how close they had been to a freezing death. He had saved lives on that grade. He had cleared the way for ambulances, propane delivery trucks, and families desperately trying to get to the hospital in the dead of winter nights. And now he got a $500 fine for his dedication. Vance picked up the lilac-purple paper, folded it neatly into a tight little triangle, and used it to light his briarwood pipe. The rich, sweet scent of cherry pipe tobacco mingled with the chemical stink of Beatrice Thorne's premium stationery. Visual harmony, Vance muttered in the quiet, empty workshop, watching the paper turn to gray ash against the hot cast iron of the wood stove. All right, Beatrice, let's see how harmonious you look when that sky falls and the cold comes to collect. To understand snow is to understand that it is not a solid, but a temporary state of crystalline suspension. It is an unstable, delicate configuration of water molecules waiting for any excuse to collapse under the combined pressure of temperature, weight, and kinetic friction. At 28 degrees Fahrenheit, snow behaves like a heavy hydraulic grease that clogs steel blades, slips heavy-duty wet clutches, and shears high-tensile steel shear bolts with effortless ease. At 10 degrees, it turns into granulated sugar, dry, uncooperative, and ready to slide down a steep slope at the slightest physical provocation. At 0 degrees and below, it behaves like coarse desert sand, chewing through carbon steel cutting edges and stripping the protective enamel paint off vehicle undercarriages like an industrial sandblaster. Beatrice Thorne did not know this. Beatrice believed that snow was a decorative element, much like the white linen tablecloth she ordered for the association's annual winter solstice gala. She had lived in Grand Heights for exactly 3 years, having moved from a gated community in Phoenix, Arizona, where the only seasonal shift was the changing of the shift schedules for the golf course maintenance crews. To her, winter was an aesthetic background for drinking mulled wine by a gas fireplace, a scenic painting that was supposed to behave itself, respect property values, and look pretty through her double-glazed panoramic windows. When she met Vance at the local hardware store 2 days after the letter was sent, she did not look at his boots, which were stained with diesel grease and bar chain oil. She looked at his face, a face carved from the same gray granite as the cliffs above the valley, lined with the deep crevices of a man who had worked under the open sky for 50 years. The hardware store was an old-school establishment, smelling of kerosene-oiled leather and the sweet, resinous scent of green hemlock. It was a place of utility, a sanctuary of structural realities, where men bought heavy-duty plumbing fittings, grade 8 bolts and shear pins, not decorative trim or pastel paints. Mr. Mitchell, she said, her voice carrying the sharp, artificial cheer of a corporate human resources seminar. I trust you received our notice. I hope there are no hard feelings. We simply must maintain a certain level of presentation up here. The prospective buyers for the new Phase 3 estates expect a certain pristine, undisturbed alpine aesthetic. Big, noisy yellow trucks spilling black smoke just don't fit the branding of Grand Heights. It looks so industrial, like an active construction site. Vance took off his grease-stained cap, his gray hair silvered by the flickering fluorescent lights of the plumbing aisle. He held a heavy brass pipe fitting in his hand, feeling its cold, reassuring weight. He was a patient man, but it was the patience of a mountain, not a saint. He had watched trees grow from saplings to timber. He could wait out a foolish woman. The road rises 900 feet in 3 miles, Mrs. Thorne, he said, his voice slow, measured, and entirely devoid of heat. There are 4 hairpin turns with a 15% grade. If that asphalt isn't scraped down to the salt line before the morning sun hits it, the melt freezes into black ice. No commercial plow can clear that grade without a sand spreader and 3 tons of steel ballast. If you don't use salt, you need chains. And if you use chains, you ruin your precious seal coat anyway. Beatrice laughed, a light, musical, entirely condescending sound that had been highly effective in real estate negotiations across the Southwest. Oh, Mr. Mitchell, you're talking about old-world destructive solutions. We live in the 21st century. We've hired EcoClear Solutions from Denver. They use state-of-the-art Mercedes Unimog vehicles with rubber-tipped blades to protect our premium asphalt seal coat. And they treat the road with an organic beet juice derivative instead of harsh corrosive salt. It's much better for the local deer population's hooves, you know. We have to think about the environment. Beet juice, Vance repeated. He let the words hang in the air between them, heavy, silent, and ridiculous. He pictured a 15-ton truck trying to claw its way up a frozen 15% grade using nothing but the sugar content of root vegetables to keep from sliding off a 300-foot cliff. Yes, it's highly recommended by the Green Roads Coalition. It creates an organic barrier that prevents ice from bonding with the road surface. So you see, your archaic services are no longer required. We've already paid their seasonal retainer. It was quite expensive, but quality always is. And we do expect the $500 fine to be settled by the 15th of this month. We want to keep our books clean for the annual audit. Vance reached into his heavy canvas coat pocket, pulled out a leather-bound checkbook that had his grandfather's historic ranching logo printed on the corner and a heavy brass fountain pen. He wrote a check for $500, blew on the ink to dry it, and handed it to her. "Here's your money, Mrs. Thorne," Vance said quietly, "and I'll need you to sign this receipt." He handed her a small yellow carbon copy slip from his pocketbook. It was a formal acknowledgement of payment, but at the bottom, in tiny, precise block lettering that required reading glasses, was a single legally binding sentence. The payer agrees to cease all maintenance modifications, sand application, and snow clearing of the Grand Heights easement immediately and indefinitely in accordance with the board's written directive dated November 1st. Beatrice glanced at it, saw the words "Acknowledgement of Payment," and signed her name with a flourish of her purple gel pen. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. I'm glad we could handle this like civilized neighbors. It's always better when we cooperate." "We did," Vance said. He put his checkbook away, his face expressionless. "We absolutely did." As he walked out of the store, the sky to the west was no longer blue. It was a flat, dead iron gray, the color of a cold gun barrel. The wind had dropped and the air had that sudden metallic taste that only comes when the Arctic decided to move south and claim what was theirs. In the valley, people think a blizzard is loud. They think of the howling wind, the rattling windows, the roar of the trees. But on the mountain, the beginning of a real storm is dead silent. It is the silence of an army taking its positions in the dark, laying its traps before the first shot is fired. Vance spent the next 48 hours in his workshop, but he was not working on the Leviathan. I was preparing his homestead for the long cold. He stacked an extra 3 cords of seasoned oak near the back porch, checked the fuel levels in his backup generator, and stocked his larder with flour, salt, dried beans, canned lard, and coffee. He parked the great Kenworth plow deep in his 3-sided barn, well behind the thick cedar tree line, where no one from the road could see it. He crawled under the massive chassis, drained the wet air tanks to prevent condensation from freezing the brake valves, removed the twin heavy-duty batteries, and carried them into his heated workshop, placing them on a trickle charger. He coated the massive chrome-plated blades of the V-plow with a thick, greasy layer of Cosmoline, a sticky brown rust preventative that smelled of petroleum, paraffin, and dead empires. It was the same grease used to preserve military rifles in arsenals for 50 years. If someone wanted to start the Leviathan now, they would need an industrial steam generator, 2 hours of preheating the engine block, and a mechanical engineering degree from the Cold War era. Vance was not about to let anyone borrow his truck when things went south. He knew the desperate mind of a city dweller when the power failed. They would try to steal his labor, his machine, and his peace. He locked the barn doors with heavy steel chains and a brass master lock. The history of this land was etched into the timber of his barn. Silas Mitchell, Vance's grandfather, had homesteaded these 400 acres in 1894. Back then, there were no zoning boards, no color palettes, and no visual harmony guidelines. Survival was the only code, and it was enforced by the cold. Silas had carved his cabin out of raw granite and hand-hewn spruce. He had survived the devastating winter of 1913 by burying himself in the root cellar with 3 sacks of potatoes and a barrel of salted pork. The mountain did not recognize human titles, and it certainly did not care about the aesthetic preferences of a retired real estate agent from Phoenix. Vance understood this ancestral truth in his bones. Next, Vance turned his attention to his gate. At the very bottom of the hill where Grand Heights Boulevard met the state highway, the road passed through Vance's private property. 30 years ago, his father had installed 2 massive timber posts, 12 inches thick, sunk 6 feet into the granite, and reinforced with concrete. Hanging from them was a gate made of heavy 3-inch steel oil-filled pipe, painted a dull forest green. The gate had been left open for 3 decades. The hinges were stiff, covered in lichen green moss and orange rust. Vance took a can of penetrating oil, a 3-foot pipe wrench, and a heavy brass padlock. He sprayed the hinges, letting the oil hiss into the rusted joints. He swung the massive steel pipe shut. It closed with a deep bell-like ring that echoed off the granite cliffs. He locked it with the brass padlock. On the center bar of the gate, he bolted a new sign. It wasn't a standard no trespassing sign from the hardware store. It was custom-made heavy aluminum engraved with black letters. Private property. Easement for residential vehicles only. Unauthorized commercial or municipal vehicles will be towed at owner's expense. Coordinates monitored by satellite. No trespassing beyond this point. Vance stood back admiring the work. The sign was entirely legal. The easement deed specifically stated that the right of passage was for residential vehicles of the residents of Grand Heights. It made no provision for commercial contractors, commercial trucks, or heavy equipment. For 30 years, Vance's family had ignored this distinction because it was convenient for everyone. But convenience is a fragile currency, and Beatrice Thorne had just spent the last of it on a whim of aesthetic preservation. Vance went back to his cabin. He built a fire in the fieldstone fireplace, loaded his record player with an old vinyl of Glenn Gould, playing Bach's Goldberg variations, and boiled a pot of black tea. Through the window, the first flakes began to fall. They were small, hard, and perfectly formed, the kind of snow that does not melt when it hits the ground, but bounces like tiny glass beads. The barometer on his wall was dropping faster than he had ever seen it. It wasn't just a winter storm, it was a bomb cyclone, an atmospheric pressure drop so violent that it would pull the moisture straight out of the Gulf of Mexico and freeze it over the Rockies in 48 hours. Vance sat in his leather armchair, took a sip of his tea, and smiled. It was the smile of a man who had done his duty for 30 years and had finally been paroled by the very people he had protected. By 8 o'clock that evening, the snow was 6 inches deep. Up on the ridge in the glass and steel castles of Grand Heights, the lights were warm and bright. In her master suite, Beatrice Thorne was talking on the phone with the manager of EcoClear Solutions, a young man named Tyler, whose voice sounded like he spent a lot of time in juice bars and corporate branding seminars. "Tyler, dear," Beatrice said, smoothing the silk of her cashmere robe. "The snow is starting to accumulate on the driveway. When can we expect the first pass of the plows? We have several guests arriving tomorrow for the wine tasting weekend." "Don't worry, Mrs. Thorne," Tyler replied over the crackle of the long-distance line from his heated office in Denver. "We've got our state-of-the-art Mercedes Unimog rigs ready to roll. They're equipped with GPS-guided rubber-edge blades. We'll be spraying our signature EcoBeat solution as we plow. It creates a molecular barrier on the asphalt that prevents ice bonding. Your road will be clear and green by morning. It's totally premium. We've got our top drivers on it." "Wonderful," Beatrice sighed. "And you're sure you won't need that local man, the one with the horrible yellow truck?" Tyler excelled at corporate arrogance. He chuckled. "The guy with the Kenworth, honestly, Mrs. Thorne, that kind of heavy steel blade is primitive. It ruins the seal coat. Our Unimogs are designed for modern municipal maintenance. We'll handle it. That dinosaur truck belongs in a museum." At midnight, the temperature on the mountain dropped to 6 degrees. At 6 degrees, the chemistry of the EcoBeat solution did something that Tyler's sales brochure had failed to mention: the water molecules separated from the organic sugars and froze instantly into a smooth gray 3/4-inch sheet of sugar-glazed ice. The beet sugars, instead of melting the snow, acted as a binding agent, turning the falling flakes into a substance with the consistency of wet, heavy porcelain. It was a perfect lubricant for rubber tires, even those with aggressive German tread patterns. When EcoClear's lead Mercedes Unimog, a $60,000 marvel of German engineering, attempted to negotiate the first 15% hairpin turn at 2 in the morning, the rubber-tipped blade did not scrape the ice. It slid over it. The driver, a 19-year-old from the suburbs of Denver, who had never driven a truck on anything steeper than a mall parking lot, felt the 15-ton rig lose traction. He tapped the brakes. This was his fatal mistake. The Unimog did not stop. It rotated slowly, gracefully, like a ballet dancer on ice, and slid backward down the grade until its rear wheels went over the embankment. The truck hung there, suspended in the dark pines at a 45-degree angle, its hazard lights flashing uselessly against the white wall of the storm. The second Unimog, attempting to rescue the first, slipped on the EcoBeat glaze and slid into the rock face on the opposite side of the road, crumpling its expensive fiberglass cab and splitting its hydraulic lines. The bright green beet juice leaked into the white snow, looking like the blood of an alien creature. By 4 in the morning, the road was completely blocked by 2 crippled German utility vehicles, 3 tons of frozen beet pulp, and 12 inches of rapidly accumulating powder. and the storm was just getting started. Vance woke at his usual time, 5 o'clock. He did not hear the roar of the Leviathan's engine. Instead, he heard the absolute suffocating silence of the mountain buried in 3 feet of snow. The wind was screaming through the pines, but the snow was so dense that the sound was muffled, turned into a low, vibrating hum that shook the cabin's foundation. He made a fresh pot of coffee, fried 3 eggs in bacon grease, and sat by his window. Through the whiteout, he saw a pair of headlights flickering at the bottom of his driveway. A figure was stumbling through the drifts, illuminated by the high beams of a small, struggling SUV. Vance put on his heavy canvas coat, his oiled leather boots, and walked out onto his porch. The cold was a physical blow, a dry, freezing hand that grabbed his throat and made his lungs burn. The figure reached the porch. It was Tyler, the manager of EcoClear. His expensive North Face jacket was soaked through, and his designer hiking boots were caked in white crust. His face was the color of skim milk, his fingers blue and stiff. Are you Mitchell?" Tyler gasped, his teeth clicking together like castanets. "I am," Vance said, leaning against the timber railing of his porch. He didn't offer the man inside. "I didn't want the wet, freezing fear of the city in his clean kitchen." "Our trucks, they're stuck," Tyler said, waving his hands wildly toward the ridge. "Both of them. One's hanging off the cliff at mile marker 2. The other is smashed against the granite wall. The road is a sheet of glass. I've got 40 families up there with no power. The lines just went down on the ridge, and we can't get any emergency vehicles up. You've got that big yellow truck. We'll pay you. We'll pay you whatever you want. Just get that Kenworth out and clear the road. Please, man, it's a crisis." Vance took a slow sip of his coffee from his insulated mug. "I can't do that, son." "What do you mean you can't?" Tyler's voice rose to a panicked shriek. "There are kids up there, old people. The temperature is dropping to 15 below tonight. You have to. I have a signed directive from the president of your association." Vance said, his voice as steady as the mountain. "It states that my vehicle is unauthorized and that its operation causes aesthetic degradation. I paid a $500 fine for clearing that road. I'm just a law-abiding citizen, Tyler. I wouldn't want to violate bylaw 14.4. I have to protect the seasonal visual harmony." "I don't care about the bylaws." Tyler screamed, his eyes wide with the terror of a city boy who had just realized that nature doesn't care about contract law or corporate marketing. "People are going to freeze. My trucks are worth $300,000, and they're going to slide into the ravine if the snow keeps piling up." "Then I suggest you call the county," Vance said. "We did. They said Grand Heights Boulevard is a private road. They said they don't have the equipment or the jurisdiction to clear a 15% grade private easement during a state of emergency. They told us to call you." "Well," Vance said, turning back toward his warm cabin door, "the county was right about the jurisdiction, but they're wrong about me. I'm retired." "I'll pay you $5,000, Tyler yelled, taking a step toward the porch. Vance stopped his hand on the iron doorknob. He looked back at Tyler. "You don't have $5,000, Tyler. And even if you did, you don't have the authority to spend it. Go back to your truck. Keep the engine running so you don't freeze. But don't stay too long. My gate at the bottom of the hill is locked and I'm about to turn off the access." "Your gate is locked," Tyler whispered, his eyes widening. "But how am I supposed to get my tow trucks in?" "You aren't," Vance said. "Commercial vehicles are a violation of my private land rights. Have a nice day, Tyler. Protect your hooves." He went inside and closed the door. The heavy timber deadbolt clicked into place with a sound that felt like the closing of a tomb. By noon on the second day, the Grand Heights Country Estates had ceased to be a luxury development and had become a very expensive, very cold archaeological site. The radiant floor, heating in the million-dollar glass cabins, had failed 12 hours earlier when the weight of the snow snapped the main power line along the ridge. The backup generators designed for short-term outages had run out of propane because the delivery trucks couldn't get up the mountain. Inside her master bedroom, Beatrice Thorne was wearing 3 fur coats, 2 pairs of cashmere pants, and a pair of ski goggles she had found in her late husband's trunk. Her fingers were too stiff to text. The indoor temperature of her mansion was 22 degrees. Her plumbing was already starting to freeze. She had heard the ominous metallic ping-clank of a copper pipe splitting in the guest bathroom wall 2 hours ago. She was huddled around a single 3-wick vanilla candle with the rest of her board members who had walked through the drifts to her house. They looked like a group of wealthy refugees who had survived a shipwreck on an island made of glass and granite. "We have to call him," said Robert, a retired corporate tax lawyer who had spent his career negotiating complex mergers, but now found himself utterly defeated by a weather pattern. "Beatrice, we have no choice. The county says they won't even think about coming up here for 3 days. The state police told us we're on private land and our own contractors' vehicles are blocked by a gate Vance locked." "He has no right to lock that gate," Beatrice hissed, though her voice lacked its usual real estate authority. It sounded dry, thin, and brittle. "It's an easement. It's a residential easement, Beatrice," Robert said, his teeth chattering. "He didn't lock us out. We can walk through the gate if we want. He locked the commercial vehicles out. The tow trucks, the propane trucks, the emergency response rigs. He's completely within his legal rights under the 1996 deed. I read the contract this morning. It's ironclad. If we force that gate, he can sue the association for trespass and void the entire easement. If he does that, our property values don't just drop, they go to absolute zero. We won't even be able to sell these houses to a logging company." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of the wind claws scraping at the triple-pane glass. The reality of their vulnerability was settling in. These were people who believed that money was a shield against any physical inconvenience. Yet here they were shivering in a multi-million-dollar tomb of their own design, held hostage by their own petty rules. "Call him," Beatrice whispered, her voice barely audible. "I tried," Robert said, holding up a dead iPhone. "The tower on the ridge is down. There's no signal. If we want to talk to him, someone has to walk down." The board members looked at each other. The walk down the mountain was 3 miles through 3 feet of unplowed snow in 15 below zero wind chills. For people whose primary form of exercise was a golf cart ride or a light stroll around a manicured pond, it was a death march. They were dressed in designer parkas and Italian leather boots, entirely unsuited for the brutal physics of a Rocky Mountain blizzard. "I'll go," Robert said, his voice quiet but resolute. He looked at his hands, already turning a light waxy gray at the knuckles. "Because if I don't, we're all going to be found here in the spring frozen solid like television dinners in our own sub-zero kitchens." It took Robert 2 hours to make the descent. The snow was up to his waist in the drifts, and the wind off the Continental Divide was a relentless icy whip that stole his breath and froze his eyelashes together. When he finally reached Vance's gate, he didn't even try to climb over it. He simply leaned his forehead against the cold forest green steel pipe and wept. His tears froze into tiny white trails of ice on his cheeks. Through his frost-rimmed eyelashes, he saw Vance Mitchell walking down his driveway. Vance was wearing a pair of wooden snowshoes, his heavy canvas coat, and carrying a thermos. He looked like an Arctic explorer walking through a backyard completely undisturbed by the storm. Vance reached the gate. He didn't unlock it. He stood on his side looking at the shivering lawyer like an old general, inspecting a defeated enemy officer who had crawled across the mud of no man's land. "You look cold, Robert," Vance said, his voice warm and steady. "Vance? Please." Robert gasped, his knees shaking violently. "We're freezing. The pipes are bursting. Beatrice is in hysterics. We've got 2 elderly people in phase 2 who need their heart medication. We'll pay the $5,000. We'll pay whatever you want. Just unlock the gate and get that truck out." Vance poured a cup of steaming chicory coffee from his thermos and handed it through the bars of the gate. Robert took it with both hands, his fingers trembling so hard he almost spilled it. He drank it like it was the elixir of life itself, feeling the heat bloom in his frozen chest. "The money doesn't interest me, Robert," Vance said quietly. "You know that. I've got enough wood to last through March, enough food to feed a platoon, and my generator has 200 gallons of diesel. I'm perfectly comfortable. What I want is security." "Anything," Robert said. "What do you want? Just tell me." Vance reached into his canvas pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was not a purple gel pen document. It was typed in a crisp, clean courier font on heavy off-white bond paper. It had been prepared by Vance's attorney in Denver 3 days ago, anticipated with the cold calculation of a man who knew his enemy. "This is an amendment to the 1996 easement deed," Vance said. "It has 5 conditions. First, the association permanently and unconditionally waives all bylaws, regulations, and aesthetic codes regarding my property and my vehicles. Second, the association will issue a formal written apology to be published in the county newspaper admitting that the fine against my vehicle was an act of bad faith harassment. Third, the association will reimburse my $500 fine plus $50,000 in liquidated damages to be paid into an escrow account for the preservation of the Mitchell Historic Homestead. Fourth, Beatrice Thorne will resign from the board immediately effective today and is permanently barred from serving in any administrative capacity in Grand Heights again. Fifth, the association will enter into a perpetual exclusive snow clearing contract with Mitchell Land and Timber. The fee is $5,000 per clearing, with a minimum of 10 clearings per winter season guaranteed regardless of snowfall. You sign this, Robert. Every member of the board signs it. I have a notary public sitting in my kitchen right now, my old army buddy who drove up before the storm hit. You sign it, and I'll have the road clear in 45 minutes. Robert looked at the paper. His eyes watered from the cold, but his legal mind still functioned well enough to recognize the absolute crushing finality of the document. Vance had not just built a trap, he had built a legal fortress from which there was no escape. If we sign this, Beatrice will sue us, Robert said, his voice cracking. Then let her sue, Vance said, turning to walk back toward his warm cabin. But she'll be doing it from a tent in the valley because by tomorrow night, her $3 million house will be a $3 million ice cube with 20 split water pipes. The mold alone will condemn the structure by summer. Your homes will be worthless ruins. Robert grabbed the steel bars of the gate. Vance, wait. I have the power of attorney for the board. We voted on it before I came down. I can sign for them. Give me the pen. Vance stopped. He turned back, reached into his coat, and produced a heavy brass fountain pen. He handed it through the gate. Robert set the paper against the flat, cold steel of the green pipe. His fingers were stiff and blue, but he signed his name with a jagged, desperate script. He stamped his official legal seal next to it with a trembling thumb. Vance took the paper back, inspected the signature, and nodded. Go sit in my workshop, Robert, Vance said, unlocking the brass padlock and swinging the heavy gate open. The stove is hot. I'll go wake the beast. In the warm shelter of Vance's workshop, Robert collapsed onto a bench near the massive wood stove. The heat hit him like a physical presence, a thick blanket of warmth that smelled of pine sap, machine oil, and sweet tobacco. Near the wall, a tall regulator clock ticked with a heavy rhythmic cadence that seemed to measure the slow return of blood to his frozen fingertips. He looked around the space, taking in the neat racks of specialized mechanical tools, the heavy lathe and the old army trunk in the corner. This was a world where things worked not because of corporate board votes or aesthetic agreements, but because of physical maintenance, respect for material limits, and hard work. Robert wrapped his shaking hands around the warm mug of coffee Vance had given him and closed his eyes, listening to the roaring fire inside the stove. Meanwhile, in the dark of the three-sided barn, Vance Mitchell stood before the Leviathan. The truck looked like a sleeping iron dinosaur, cold and covered in a thin skin of grease and dust. But Vance knew every bolt, every line, and every valve in its massive body. I had built this machine with his own hands, using parts salvaged from old military surplus yards, heavy construction sites, and logging equipment. He carried the two heavy-duty batteries out from his workshop, their cases warm from the trickle charger. He dropped them into the steel tray, bolted the heavy cables to the terminals, and tightened them with a stubby wrench. He opened the fuel valves, primed the mechanical lift pump until he felt the resistance of solid diesel fuel, and plugged in the industrial block heater to his generator for a brief 15-minute blast of high-voltage heat. He didn't need to heat the whole block, just enough to get the thick 20-weight oil moving through the oil galleries of the massive Detroit diesel. Vance climbed into the high cab. The air inside was freezing, smelling of cold vinyl old iron and the dry, sweet scent of chicory. He turned the key. The starter motor, a heavy-duty Delco Remy unit designed for military tanks, engaged with a deep mechanical clatter. The massive engine turned over once, twice. Then with a roar that shook the snow off the barn roof, the twin-turbocharged Detroit diesel screamed to life. It was not a modern engine. It did not hum or purr. It roared with a fierce, primeval two-stroke scream, a deafening mechanical thunder that rattled the windows of the cabin and shook the ground beneath Vance's boots. A thick, beautiful column of black diesel smoke shot straight up from the dual chrome stacks, cutting through the white falling snow like a dark flag of defiance. Vance let the engine idle for 10 minutes, watching the oil pressure needle rise to a steady, reassuring 60 pounds. He tapped the air pressure gauges, watching the twin needles climb as the mechanical compressor filled the tanks. He dropped the massive custom-welded V-plow until its carbon steel cutting edge hovered just an inch above the concrete floor. He engaged the heavy-duty transfer case, put the 5-speed Allison transmission into low gear, and backed the monster out of the barn. The Leviathan moved into the storm, a yellow titan ready for war. The ascent of Grand Heights Boulevard was a display of pure hydraulic violence. Vance did not plow the road. He conquered it. He dropped the massive 12-foot steel V-blade until it struck the frozen asphalt with a metallic clack that could be heard through the roar of the engine. The carbon steel edge tore through the 3-inch layer of frozen beet juice ice like a hot knife through tallow. The vibration in the steering column was immense, a physical shudder that traveled through the steel chassis and into Vance's calloused hands, but the old truck did not waver. The snow did not simply roll off the blade, it was launched. The massive curved wings of the custom V-plow threw the 3 feet of heavy mountain powder 40 feet into the air, creating a spectacular rolling white wave that buried the manicured spruce trees, decorative mailboxes, and hidden golf course markers along the roadside. The air smelled of hot iron sulfur and raw diesel fuel, a brutal mechanical scent that completely overwhelmed the sweet chemical artificial pine aromas of the valley. The Detroit diesel screamed at 2,400 RPM, its twin turbochargers whistling with a high-pitched mechanical shriek as the truck clawed its way up the 15% grade. The 16-ply military surplus tires wrapped in heavy-duty iron ice chains bit deep into the underlying asphalt, leaving deep jagged scars in the premium seal coat that Beatrice Thorne had been so desperate to protect. Every turn of the wheel was a calculated insult to the visual harmony of the association. The Leviathan left behind a wide black, perfectly clean swath of bare asphalt, flanked on either side by towering 6-foot walls of discolored sand grit slush and compacted gray ice. At mile marker 2, Vance reached the first crippled Mercedes Unimog. The expensive German utility rig was still hanging over the bank, looking small and pathetic in the deep drifts. The 19-year-old driver was huddled inside the cab, shivering violently. Vance didn't stop. He lowered his side wing plow, caught the rear bumper of the Unimog with the corner of his steel blade, and with a single casual surge of hydraulic power, shoved the $60,000 machine entirely off the road and down into the deep ravine. The truck rolled twice before settling against a massive pine, its expensive fiberglass body panels splintering into 1,000 yellow pieces. "Protect your hooves," Vance muttered as he drove past. He reached the second Unimog half a mile later. It was blocking the center of the road. Vance didn't even slow down. He rammed the steel V-plow directly into the front bumper of the stuck truck. The impact was a deafening boom that shook the mountain. The Unimog's front axle snapped like a dry twig, and the entire vehicle was cast aside into the ditch like an empty soda can. By the time Vance reached the summit of Grand Heights, the storm had begun to clear the clouds, parting to reveal a cold, pale sun that cast long blue shadows across the buried mansions. The residents of the ridge were standing on their porches wrapped in blankets and fur coats, watching the massive yellow monster roll down their street. They didn't care about the black tire marks on their premium asphalt. They didn't care about the noise, the diesel smoke, or the visual disfigurement of their scenic pathway. They saw the black road. They saw their salvation. They began to cheer. Some of them wept. Vance drove slowly down the center of the street, the massive plow clearing a path directly to Beatrice Thorne's front door. He dropped the blade with a heavy ground-shaking thud through the Kenworth into park and let the massive engine idle its exhaust stacks, blowing a steady rhythmic pulse of black smoke against the pristine glass facade of her multi-million-dollar home. Beatrice was standing on her porch, her face pale, her lips blue. She looked at Vance, then at the massive scarred road, and finally at the paper Robert was holding in his trembling hands. Vance rolled down the heavy glass window of his cab. The smell of hot diesel grease and cheap cherry tobacco filled the cold mountain air. "Morning, Beatrice," Vance said, his voice carrying clearly over the deep roar of the Detroit diesel. "I cleared your road, but I think your contractor left a couple of things in my ditch. You might want to call a tow truck." Beatrice didn't answer. She couldn't. Vance pulled his brass fountain pen from his pocket, blew a ring of sweet smoke into the freezing air, and put the truck in gear. "Have a harmonious winter, Mrs. Thorne," he said. He turned the Leviathan around, the heavy iron chains on his tires clawing deep permanent scars into her premium asphalt, and drove back down his mountain, leaving the wealthy residents of Grand Heights to sweep up the ashes of their decorative paradise. If winter on the mountain is an exercise in violent frozen suppression, spring is the untidy revelation of everything that was hidden beneath the white sheet of silence. In the Colorado Rockies, April does not arrive with the gentle poetic kissing of buds and the sweet song of bluebirds. It arrives like a municipal cleanup crew after a riot loud wet, mud-slicked, and smelling of rotting organic matter. As the deep mountain pack began to recede under the relentless pale glare of the spring sun, it did not reveal the alpine paradise Beatrice Thorne had promised her prospective Phase 3 buyers. Instead, it exposed the raw mechanical scars of a winter fought and lost. First came the smell, the organic eco-beat solution, which Beatrice had proudly claimed would protect the deer population's hooves, had spent 5 months fermenting under 3 feet of compacted ice. As the ice liquefied, the sugar-dense residue did not wash away. It rotted. A thick, sweetish, vinegary stench of fermenting beet pulp and stagnant swamp water rose from the ditches of Grand Heights Boulevard, settling over the million-dollar glass and steel cabins like a heavy, invisible fog. The local deer, far from feeling grateful, actively avoided the road, repulsed by the sour chemical vinegar odor of the rotting vegetable brine. Then came the metal. At mile marker 2, where the snowbanks finally shrank back into the granite ditches, the remains of the EcoClear Solutions fleet were finally paraded before the sun. The first $60,000 Mercedes Unimog, which Vance had casually shoved into the ravine with the wing blade of the Leviathan, sat crumpled at the base of a 100-year-old ponderosa pine. The winter moisture had already begun to rust its exposed steel frame. Its expensive fiberglass body panels had turned a sickly faded yellow under the relentless mountain ultraviolet light. Half a mile further up, the second Unimog lay on its side in the ditch, its broken front axle pointing toward the sky like the fractured leg of a dead beast. Vance Mitchell stood on the shoulder of the road, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his oil-stained canvas jacket. He watched a lone magpie perch on the crumpled hood of the first Unimog, its beak pecking curiously at a shred of rubber tire. Behind him, the low, rhythmic idle of his old Kenworth truck. The Leviathan vibrated through the soles of his boots. Then, I hadn't brought the plow blade today. The road was clear of snow, though it was now covered in a thick, gritty layer of gray sand and crushed granite. The premium asphalt seal coat that Beatrice had guarded so fiercely was gone, pulverized into a scarred, pitted track by the heavy-duty iron tire chains of the 25-ton Kenworth. A sleek black Audi crossover descended the hill from the ridge, its suspension groaning as its low-profile tires hit a deep, water-filled pothole that had opened up where the beet juice had eaten through the asphalt binder. The window rolled down, and Robert, the HOA's vice president and resident legal counsel, looked out. His face was thin, pale, and lacked the polished arrogance of the previous autumn. "Mitchell," Robert said, his voice flat, exhausted, "I suppose you're enjoying the view." Vance took his briar pipe from his mouth, blew a thin ring of cherry-scented smoke that struggled against the sour stench of the rotting beet juice, and nodded toward the ravine. "The mountain always keeps its receipts, Robert. I was just wondering if the tow trucks are going to need an easement to haul those German carcasses out of my ditch." Robert winced. "They aren't just carcasses, Mitchell. They're Exhibit A and B." "Exhibit for what?" "A $1.2 million lawsuit." Robert said, his knuckles whitening on the leather-wrapped steering wheel of his Audi. "Tyler's insurance company is suing EcoClear for the loss of the rigs, and Beatrice's personal attorney has joined the suit representing the Grand Heights Homeowners Association. They're filing against you for willful destruction of property, interference with a commercial contract, and operating an unlicensed commercial utility vehicle on a private easement." Vance didn't flinch, his gray eyes hard as the granite cliffs behind him drifted from Robert to the crumpled Unimog in the ravine, then back again. "They're suing me," Vance murmured, his voice carrying the low, dangerous rumble of a rock slide waiting for an excuse to begin. "After she signed the yellow slip, after you signed the deed amendment in the middle of a blizzard. They're claiming duress, Mitchell," Robert said, looking away toward the valley below. "Beatrice's lawyer is going to argue that the deed amendment was signed under extreme environmental coercion, that you held the entire community hostage by withholding essential services during a state of emergency. They're going to invalidate the amendment, reinstate the fines, and make you pay for those 2 Unimogs." Vance took another slow pull from his pipe. He looked up at the ridge where the high glass windows of Beatrice Thorne's mansion glittered like cold diamonds in the morning sun. "Well, Robert," Vance said softly, "I've always found that the problem with filing a lawsuit is that it forces both sides to open up their closets. And some closets have very old, very dusty bones." The courtroom in the Denver County District Courthouse was small, sterile, and smelled of industrial floor wax and stale coffee. It was a room designed for the cold, methodical dissection of human greed, far removed from the howling winds and brutal realities of the Continental Divide. Beatrice Thorne sat at the plaintiff's table flanked by a young, aggressively styled attorney named Julian Vance, no relation to Vance Mitchell, who wore a bespoke navy suit and a watch that cost more than Vance's entire winter stockpile of firewood. Beatrice was dressed in a sharp slate gray wool suit, her hair coiffed into a rigid defensive helmet. She looked every bit the victim of mountain lawlessness, her eyes fixed on the judge with an expression of practiced aristocratic suffering. At the defense table, Vance Mitchell sat alone. He had refused to hire a high-priced Denver firm, choosing instead to represent himself, assisted only by an old Army buddy named Marcus Vance, coincidentally sharing the name, though Marcus was a retired military judge advocate from Fort Carson. Vance wore his only suit, a heavy dark charcoal wool blend that smelled faintly of cedar shavings and mothballs, which he had bought for his father's funeral 10 years ago. "The defense's argument is absurd, Your Honor." Julian, the plaintiff's attorney, paced the linoleum floor with the smooth, predator-like grace of a corporate litigator. "We have a clear case of environmental extortion. Mr. Mitchell, a retired military engineer, willfully used his unique position, his possession of an industrial-grade military vehicle, and his ownership of the lower gate to hold 42 families hostage during a historic winter storm." Julian paused, turning to gesture dramatically toward Beatrice. "My client, Mrs. Thorne, under the threat of literal hypothermia for herself and her neighbors, was forced to sign away the association's long-standing regulatory rights. She was forced to sign a deed amendment that strips the HOA of its authority to manage its own scenic easements. This was not a contract, Your Honor. It was a treaty signed at gunpoint where the gun was the freezing cold of a Colorado blizzard." The judge, a weathered woman named Henderson, who looked like she had spent her youth hiking the San Juans before she ever sat on a bench, looked over her reading glasses at Vance. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Henderson said, her voice dry and gravelly, "how do you respond to the claim of duress? Did you in fact refuse to clear the road unless the plaintiff signed the deed amendment?" Vance stood up. He did not pace. He stood with the straight, rigid posture of a man who had spent 30 years standing before military tribunals and review boards. He did not look at Beatrice, nor did he look at her expensive lawyer. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice calm, measured, and entirely devoid of theatricality, "I didn't refuse to clear the road. I was officially ordered to stop." Vance reached into his leather briefcase, an old olive-drab canvas satchel from his Army days, and pulled out 3 documents, placing them on the clerk's desk. "Document 1, Your Honor, is a formal cease and desist order dated November 1st, signed by Beatrice Thorne under the official seal of the Grand Heights Homeowners Association. It states in no uncertain terms that my vehicle, the Leviathan, was unauthorized, and that its operation constituted a violation of Bylaw 14.4. It assessed a $500 fine and warned me that further operations would result in legal action." The judge flipped through the paper, nodding slowly. "Document 2, Vance continued, is the yellow carbon copy receipt for the payment of that fine signed by Mrs. Thorne on November 3rd at the local hardware store. At the bottom of that receipt is a signed covenant. It states that in exchange for the payment of the fine, I would immediately and indefinitely cease all maintenance, sanding, and snow removal on the Grand Heights easement. Mrs. Thorne signed this document in a public place 3 days before the first snowflake ever fell. There was no blizzard, Your Honor. There was no hypothermia. There was only a $500 check, which she gladly deposited into the HOA's account." Julian, the plaintiff's lawyer, jumped up. "Your Honor, the receipt is a minor administrative slip. The real issue is the deed amendment signed on November 8th during the peak of the storm when Mr. Mitchell refused to operate his truck unless he was granted a permanent exemption from all HOA rules and a $50,000 road maintenance contract." "I didn't refuse to operate my truck, Your Honor," Vance said, his voice dropping slightly, carrying a heavy, quiet weight. "I was unable to." Vance reached into his satchel and pulled out a stack of high-resolution photographs along with a printed logbook. "On November 5th, following the association's written order to cease and desist, I prepared my vehicle for long-term storage. I removed the heavy-duty batteries, drained the air lines, and applied Cosmoline, a heavy rust-preventative grease, to the plow blades. This is standard military procedure for decommissioning heavy equipment. It is a 4-hour process to reverse. When the manager of EcoClear Solutions, Tyler Vance, arrived at my cabin at 5 in the morning on November 8th, he did not find a man ready to plow. He found a retired citizen whose equipment was legally and physically out of service. The judge leaned forward, studying the photographs of the massive Kenworth sitting on wooden blocks, its batteries sitting on a charger in Vance's warm workshop, its blades covered in sticky brown grease. Furthermore, Vance said, the deed amendment was not drafted by me. It was drafted by the HOA's own vice president and legal counsel, Robert Sterling, who is present in this courtroom today. Robert, knowing that the county had refused to intervene and that EcoClear's vehicles were blocking the road, drafted the amendment to protect the lives of the residents. He did so after reviewing the easement's original 1996 deed, which clearly states that no public funds may be used for its maintenance and that the easement is strictly for residential vehicles, a clause that the HOA had been violating for years by hiring commercial contractors like EcoClear. Vance looked at Beatrice then. It was a long, cold look that made her shift uncomfortably in her slate gray suit. Mrs. Thorne wanted visual harmony and commercial, eco-friendly solutions. Vance said, his voice laced with a subtle, razor-sharp irony. I simply gave her exactly what she asked for. I complied with her orders. I stayed off her road. And when her modern, eco-friendly solution failed because they tried to climb a 15% mountain grade with vegetable juice, she realized that the only thing keeping her paradise from turning into a frozen tomb was 30 tons of old-world yellow industrial steel. But the real blow did not come from the contract law. It came from the ledger. Marcus Vance's military law advisor stood up and presented the final piece of evidence, a document that had been obtained through a forensic subpoena of the HOA's financial records, which Marcus had filed during the discovery phase of the lawsuit. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice booming with the authority of a man who had spent 20 years prosecuting military embezzlement cases. We have here the financial logs of the Grand Heights Homeowners Association for the past 3 fiscal years. During the discovery process, we discovered that the eco-friendly snow management firm hired by Mrs. Thorne, EcoClear Solutions, was registered to a holding company in Delaware. The sole managing partner of that holding company is a young man named Tyler Thorne. The courtroom went dead silent. Robert, sitting behind Beatrice, buried his face in his hands. Tyler Thorne, Marcus continued, is the nephew of the plaintiff, Beatrice Thorne. Furthermore, the contract awarded to EcoClear Solutions was for $85,000 for the winter season, nearly 4 times the market rate for mountain road maintenance. This contract was awarded without a competitive bidding process, in direct violation of the HOA's own bylaws regarding transactions with interested parties. Marcus placed a spreadsheet on the judge's bench. But it gets worse, Your Honor. The $85,000 paid to EcoClear was not drawn from the HOA's general operating fund. It was drawn from the Emergency Infrastructure Reserve Fund, a fund designated strictly for the repair of the retaining walls, drainage systems, and structural elements of the boulevard. As a result of this unauthorized transfer, the HOA's reserve account was completely depleted. In simple terms, Mrs. Thorne emptied her neighbor's emergency savings to pay her nephew 4 times the market rate for a service that resulted in the destruction of 2 expensive vehicles and the complete blockage of the road. Judge Henderson's eyes narrowed as she stared at the spreadsheets. The silence in the room was no longer sterile. It was suffocating. Is this true, Mrs. Thorne? Judge Henderson asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Beatrice opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her perfect aristocratic helmet of hair seemed to deflate. She looked at her attorney, Julian, but the young man was already closing his leather briefcase, his face blank, his interest in the case having evaporated the moment the word embezzlement was spoken. Your Honor, Julian said, standing up and smoothing his tie. In light of these new developments, my firm must respectfully request to withdraw as counsel for the plaintiff. We were not made aware of these financial transactions during our initial assessment of the case. Request granted, Judge Henderson snapped. She looked back down at the documents before her, then at Vance Mitchell, who was standing quietly, his old canvas bag slung over his shoulder. This court finds that the deed amendment signed on November 8th was not signed under duress, but was rather a necessary legal and binding correction of a long-standing easement violation. Judge Henderson declared, her gavel resting in her hand. The plaintiff's claims for property damage and breach of contract are dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Mitchell's private property rights, as established by the 1894 homestead deed and the 1996 easement agreement, are absolute. She paused, looking directly at Beatrice Thorne. Furthermore, this court is referring the financial records of the Grand Heights Homeowners Association to the State Attorney General's office for a formal investigation into corporate fraud, embezzlement, and self-dealing. Boom! The sound of the gavel hitting the wooden block was loud, sharp, and final. It sounded exactly like the iron blade of the Leviathan hitting the frozen asphalt of Grand Heights Boulevard. By late May, the Grand Heights Country Estates Homeowners Association was no more. The revelation of Beatrice Thorne's self-dealing had ripped through the community like a wildfire through dry pine. Faced with a depleted reserve fund, a crumbling road that would cost $300,000 to repave, and the prospect of individual assessments of nearly $10,000 per household, to cover the pending lawsuits, the residents had done the only logical thing left to them. They voted to dissolve the association. Beatrice's massive glass and steel mansion on the ridge was the first to go up for sale. It sat on the market for months, its price dropping by $50,000 every week. But no one wanted to buy a home on a hill that had no HOA, no paved road, and a reputation for freezing in the dark. Eventually, she packed her bags and slunk back to Phoenix, leaving her alpine paradise behind like an empty skin. The road was still there, but it was no longer Grand Heights Boulevard. It had reverted to its original name, the name Silas Mitchell had given it in 1894, Mitchell's Pass. It was a rough road now. The asphalt, stripped of its premium seal coat, had cracked and crumbled under the spring rains, turning back into a rugged gravel and dirt track that winding through the steep granite. The fancy timber frame entrance sign at the bottom of the hill had been taken down, replaced by a simple weathered wooden post that Vance had carved himself. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the Continental Divide, casting a deep copper glow across the peaks, Vance sat on the porch of his cabin. He was cleaning his father's old pocket knife, the bone handle cool and smooth in his calloused hand. From the valley below, he heard the low rhythmic roar of a heavy engine. It wasn't a Mercedes Unimog. It wasn't an expensive German utility rig. It was an old, rusted Ford F-250, its bed filled with propane tanks and firewood, clawing its way up the gravel pass with a slow, noisy, entirely non-premium determination. It was Robert who had decided to stay on the ridge, having bought his house back from the bank for a fraction of its original cost. As Robert's truck passed Vance's gate, which was now left wide open, its hinges oiled and silent, he tapped his horn twice. It was a short, respectful greeting, the acknowledgement of a man who had finally learned that on the mountain survival is not an aesthetic choice. Vance raised his pipe in a silent, slow salute. The air was warm, smelling of pine needles, wet granite, and the sweet, clean promise of summer. The snow was gone, but Vance knew it would return. It always did. The cold was patient, and the mountain had a very long memory. But until then, the pass belonged to the Kenworth, and the Kenworth belonged to Vance.